delighted to introduce Jane Alexander, who, in my opinion, and I think the world, is probably our top well-being author, writer and expert on all aspects of well-being in the UK. So I'm going to read this out because it's just so splendid. I really feel I have to, and I won't remember it. So Jane has got over 35 years experience in wellness, spirituality and well-being travel sectors. As a journalist, she pioneered, she absolutely did, holistic health in the Daily Mail, and has written for the vast majority of the UK Nationals, Glossip and Health Press, from ID to Elle, from the Telegraph to Top Sante, Cosmopolitan to the Lady. When did you start?
Oh my God, I was in the 80s.
Jane was certainly the first writer and expert I knew in the whole wellbeing area. She's also the best-selling author of over 20 wellness titles, including Spirit of the Home, Ancient Wisdom for Modern Living and the Holistic Therapy Bible. I'm delighted to say that we have Jane's books here in Seed Store, and we have some here for her to sign if anybody would like to know more or buy some later. So Jane's going to give a talk about her passions. I'm going to let her get on with it. She's got it all worked out, and we also hope we can have a little interactive aspect to this at the end. So everybody, big welcome to Jane Alexander.
Thank you very, very much. What I'm going to do before I do anything else is take some of my props, which is speaking with confidence. And because look, my hands are shaking. And speak your truth, aroma roller. Because you know what, I'm a writer, but I'm not a speaker. I don't think of myself as a speaker, and that's my story. Listening to what you were saying before, one of the stories we tell ourselves when we're very small, and one of the stories we tell ourselves as we get older. And on the way over on the train, I was thinking about this, and I thought, you know what? When I was a small girl, if you had said to me, age 8, I want you to stand up and read out your story in front of the class, I'd be like, yeah, let me do it, I want to do it. Now it's like, oh my God, no. Oh my God, I would rather walk over hot coals. I really would. So then I thought, what do you do? What do you do? If you're someone like me, if you're a journalist, you go on the internet, don't you? And you look up to see, how do you do a talk? And on the internet, what it says is, you have to tell people what you're going to tell them. Then you have to give them 3 points. 1, 2, 3. And then you have to conclude by telling them what you've told them. And I thought, okay, I can do that, because you know I'm a good girl, I'm a people pleaser, and that's what we do. And so I sort of hunted around, and I thought, yeah, I've got my 3 points. And then I thought, yeah, but that point kind of starts merging in with that point, and then that point links in with that point, and before you know where we are, you've got a mess of knitting. But isn't that what we do? Isn't that what we do, I think, as women, particularly when we tell stories, is that we weave. And we weave in and out, and we pull threads from here and threads from there and threads from other places. And so my 3 points, which I will keep, and I will keep these here so I don't wander off entirely, are that I'm going to tell you why I think we're all storytellers. We're all of us. And I think we've already demonstrated that pretty well. And why stories matter. And then I'm going to tell you what I learned as a journalist over a long, hideously long career. And that's that one of the key aspects is listening. How if we want to honour people's stories, we have to learn how to listen. And to listen very deeply, not just superficially. Because a lot of the time, don't we all want to jump in? It's like, oh yeah, no, I had that, but mine was worse. Or, you know, that happened to me, but it was bigger, and it was way bigger than that. And so on. So listening, important. And the third one, I think I want to touch on, is why the most important story we tell is our own, and how often we lie. We lie to ourselves. We tell stories. And I know I've done that so much. A lot of the last part of my journey as a writer has been investigating deep transformational retreats. And on those, I learned that a lot of the stories I told about my upbringing, about myself, weren't quite true, or they weren't the full story. And I think when we start digging down into our own real stories, then we have a real chance to heal ourselves, to heal each other. And actually, and this sounds like a big ask, but I really do think we heal the world. Because we can't go out there and yell at the world to change. Sadly, it won't. But by uncovering our own selves, our authentic selves, I think we can start to change. So, I'd love to tell you that I really, really wanted, first thing I ever wanted to be was a writer. But actually it wasn't. When I was a kid, what I really wanted was a stable full of ponies. I really, I wanted to be called Sharon. That's all I really wanted when I was a kid. And in fact, I found this last year. And this is my very first, this is Jane Williams, as I was, storybook. And here's the story I wrote when I was about 8. My name is Sharon, and I live at Honeysuckle Cottage. No, I didn't. In my mind I did. I lived in South London, well, what's now South London, at the time it was Surrey. And I lived with my dog Candy and my horse Whiskey, and an old deaf Uncle Wilfred. Heaven knows where he came from. One night I heard an owl's hoot, and another hoot, as if it was a signal. Then I heard yelps, and the sound of a dog whimpering. I jumped out. Surely it was Candy. I slipped on my dressing gown and ran downstairs. I saw 2 shadows slipping away with a sack. One of them said, "Let's go now to Longwind Hill, but we'll have to be careful of the moor." For you see, I live near Dartmoor. There was only one thing to do. I must ride across Dartmoor. And this was terrifying, for Dartmoor is full of bogs, with a capital B. I bridled Whiskey and started to ride across Dartmoor. I don't know how I got across, but I did. And I rescued Candy. But best of all, next day in the newspaper, the headlines read, "Brave girl rescues dog and finds dog thieves." I got a team point for that, and a little note that said, "Interesting and well written." And I honestly thought I was the bee's knees at writing. I really did. And then last year a really funny thing happened, an amazing thing actually, and that was that a whole bunch of us that went to the same school got together via Facebook. It was extraordinary. I mean, we were about 120 of us in our year group, and 60 people got together, and we had a meeting at our old school, and it was quite incredible, because that took me right back, because these were people that knew me before, if you like, the shit happened. It was how I was they knew me when I was this little girl that wanted to stand up and tell stories in front of the class. And they also brought along their exercise books. And I looked at some of their stories, and it was like, wow, we all told stories then. We all wrote stories, and they were good. They were great. I wasn't particularly special. My stories, actually, when I looked at them, I thought, well, actually, they weren't that great, really. But it's something that then, why do we stop? Why do we stop that? And I think it isn't just storytelling. It's storytelling in all its forms, if you like. It's not just the writing. It's why do we stop doing art? Why do we stop dancing like crazy beings? Why do we stop singing? And it comes as that voice, isn't it? That little critic that goes, because you're not very good. Or that it's not supposed to be like that, it's supposed to be like this. These authority figures that tell us how we should be, how we should tell our stories. And I remember my very first day at school, we were given a sheet to colour in. And there were pictures of different things, animals and what have you, and you had to colour them in. And I loved this, so I coloured them all in. And the teacher came round and she looked, and she said, "Oh, that's very neat, Jane, very good. Keeping inside the lines, that's how it's supposed to be." And she said, I'm going to give you a star. She said, "But there's just one thing." She said, "The sun isn't red." What? Sunsets? And she said, no. She said, "The sun is yellow." And she said, "Look around." She said, "Has anyone else got a red sun here?" And everyone was like, "No." "What colour are your suns?" "Yellow." I was like, okay. And so I never ever drew the sun yellow again. And it hit me again when my son changed school. we used to do all that very, very creative play. We used to get down on the floor, we'd make messy paintings, and he told wild stories that were so inventive and so incredible. And then he went to this school and he came home one day and he had a painting, and I looked at it, and in fact I couldn't actually stop looking horrified, because it was nothing, it was static and just weird. And I think he caught up with something. He said, you know, Mum, that's how you draw a house. That's what it's supposed to look like. Really? I said, but how does it feel? He said, no. That's how it's, because the teacher told me so. That's how it's supposed to be. And how many of us here, how many of you stopped doing something you loved when you were at school because of a teacher or someone who said to you, that's not how you do it, that's not how it should be? I'm seeing a lot of people nodding. I guess we all have, in one way or another. I stopped singing because someone said, "Oh, that was a bum note," and it was like, so I never sang. I stopped. I know so many people who stuff their creativity just down and down and down, and we stuff our stories down. And we learn how to be quiet, how to be polite, and how to be nice. And you know what? When it comes to telling stories, that's absolutely shit. Because real stories are not nice. I mean, you know this. I mean, what happens if you watch a TV programme and you're thinking, God, is anything ever going to happen in this? It's just, you know, with the really bad ones. Or, no, they're not. And think back to how we all started when, you know, we were sitting around those fires and we were telling stories, we were telling folk stories, we were telling fairy stories. And those stories were brutal. I don't know about you, but I loved sort of, you know, Grimm's fairy stories when I was a kid. And I like the unexpurgated versions, you know, the ones where hands got lopped off, you know, and you went down into caves and there were monsters there. It wasn't all sweet little princesses. People were, you know, the witches were really, really hardcore. And you learn through that. We learn through that. Stories are archetypal in that way. They speak to us on a really, really deep, deep level. I mean, the story that I've always loved, one of the myths I've always adored, is that of Inanna, a Sumerian goddess who is deep and complex, and who went down into the underworld to meet her sister Ereshkigal, who killed her with a glance and hung her on a meat hook and let her rot for 3 days. Yeah, it's super powerful. And if you're interested in that, that's in The Energy Secret. And that's a story about being in our power and also facing our shadow. And I'll talk a bit more about that maybe a bit later on, because otherwise we're going to kind of go around in circles. But what I'm saying, I think, is that real stories have power. And that when we tell real stories and when we tell our truth, we touch people. And it's why the media use stories. I mean, I'm sure we've all been looking at the news, and in our heads we can be horrified at what's going on. And we understand it intellectually when we hear about bombing. But we don't really feel it in our hearts and our guts until we hear the stories of the people that are directly involved. And it's how we communicate, it's how we empathise, and it's how we understand each other, or how we can begin to understand each other. It's by telling our stories. And I think it's really important that we tell stories. And I think it's really important that we listen to other people's stories, and not just to people we agree with. And that's the really vital bit. Someone on Twitter, someone I know the other day, was saying, oh, I heard this awful, awful story that they were interviewing this woman who agreed with Putin on Radio 4. And I heard that too. And I was so pleased that that was being put out there, because how do we ever begin to understand people if we don't know what they're saying, if we don't know what they're thinking? And yet all too often we just tend to say, oh, I don't like that opinion, I don't like that, they're not my tribe, they're not my gang, so therefore I'm not going to listen. And somehow we've all become, as I say, so polarised, particularly social media does it, and it does it through algorithms. I'm sure I don't need to tell you that, I'm sure you all know it. And I'm sure everyone here has probably seen the docudrama The Social Dilemma. If you haven't, have a look. It's on Netflix, and it really simply and easily, I think, explains how algorithms work and how we get pulled in to being in our own little echo chamber. And so we only hear the voices that we agree with, which is nice. It's nice and it's comforting, and it gives us that feeling of, oh yeah, well, I'm okay, and no one says, no, you're wrong. But it's only one side of the story. And nothing is ever so simple, is it? It's sad, it's not. The one thing I've really learned over the last few years, and right through my career, is that you're not going to agree with everyone, and that's fine. And actually, that's really good. And that the most important word is and. So it's, well, I think this, and not but and. I can also think this. It's this tiny little twist, and it's a linguistic twist, but I think it makes all the difference. So it's not saying, well, yes, but I think you're wrong because or it's saying that you can hold things in balance, and we need that. We need that now more than ever, and that's something I passionately believe that storytelling can do. It can help us understand each other. And as I say, we don't have to agree with people, and sometimes it's bad if we do. And I'll give you a funny little example of this. At one point, way back in my career, I was working briefly for a magazine, and I got sent out to interview a couple who apparently were so madly in love that they never parted. And so I turned up at this, and it was a bungalow in Essex. And it was all nice, it was great. We sat down and we were having a cup of tea and we were having a chat, and it was lovely. And then one woman said, oh, excuse me, I just got to go to the loo. And off she went. And next thing, the other woman gets up. And off she goes. Okay. All right. So I sat there, and then when they came back, I said, well, sorry about that. I said, can I just clarify here? Did you go to the loo together? And they went, yeah. We are never apart. We never, ever separate at all. And I thought, oh, that's lovely. How sweet. How gorgeous. Anyway, because I'm an empath, I'm afraid. It works well when you're a journalist because you can automatically understand where people are coming from. But anyway, I drove off. About half an hour down the road, I pulled over to have a drink. I thought, was that lovely? No, actually that was completely and utterly crazy, and I would not want to live my life like that. But they did, and that's fine. And I think the other, it's just important. I think it's important to listen to a wide variety of stories. My career in journalism actually started with a mistake. With a story that wasn't true, with a lie, if you like. And it goes back to that idea of who we are and who we think we are and what we think is good enough and right enough and not good enough. So I went to Manchester and I studied English, which, there was a huge department, there were loads of us, and I thought it was actually pretty boring. So when I went to parties, I never ever said that I did English. They'd say, oh, what are you doing? And I was going, having had a few drinks. Oh, I study astrophysics, and really hope that there wasn't an astrophysicist on the other hand, because I didn't want to say that I was just doing something boring. And I thought I'd lucked out, because towards the end of my third year, I answered an ad in The Guardian, I think it was, and I got this job as a presenter and researcher for a new TV magazine programme that was going to go on to the newly formed Channel 4, and I thought, got it, smug as hell, thought I'd made it. Pride comes before a fall. I had a call, and I said, look, I'm really sorry about this. What I didn't tell you was that I hadn't actually got the contract firmed up, and I'm afraid someone else has got it. And so someone else had my job, and I was left with nothing. And that someone actually was Paulie Yates, which is an interesting one, yeah. And She did it a lot better than I would ever have done it. But hey. And
That's a story in itself.
isn't it?
How do you know?
Huh?
How do you know?
Well, because the programme that got commissioned was The Tube with Paul Yates and Jules Holland.
Yeah.
Oh no! All right. I didn't do it. But having had done a fair bit of TV, I actually, it's not my.
I've been lying on the bed with all those.
I'd have been lying on the bed. I'd have so been lying on the bed probably then. Yeah. But so.
Well, her story's a sad story.
It is a sad story.
Tragic story. So,
Yes, a very, very tragic story.
What is
Yeah.
meant to be is meant to be, isn't it?
And that's the thing, isn't it? That we never quite know. You never know which path you take, and if you went down that different route.
Exactly.
But how I got into journalism was fascinating because, as I say, that job fell through, so I went and did what most people do. So I just went to London because London was where it was at. And this was the 80s. And I got a job in box office, first of all for the Palace Theatre. And then my boss moved, and so I went to Earl's Court Exhibition Centre and did the accounts for the Royal Tournament, which is about the most unlikely job I can think I could possibly have, given that I just about scraped through maths O-level as it was then, GCSE. And I liked it. I loved my job, and actually I sometimes think, separating paths and all that, I would probably have been happier if I'd stayed there. They were lovely people, it was great, and we had a great social life. But there you go. One night I went to an opening of a club in Soho, a nightclub, and I was in my sort of work gear, which I was pretty flamboyant still for then, but it wasn't really out there. And the club was Skin 2, which was a fetish club. Walked in, everyone was like looking amazing, wearing skin tight latex and rubber and God knows what, and I felt really boring. So once again it was like, what do I do? Do I really say, if someone asks me, I work in a box office, I work for the Royal Tournament, which is effectively the military. Wasn't a good look, not a good look in your sort of edgy mid-20s or early 20s. And so when I got talking to this guy at the bar, I said, I'm a freelance journalist, because I thought that sounded suitably cool. And he said, that's funny, because I'm a freelance photographer, and I've got this story I kind of want to work on about occult fashion designers. And do you fancy doing it? And I was like, yeah, sure, no problem. Next morning I wake up and I'm looking and there's this sort of, piece of paper with things written on it, and it's just like, oh my God, now what? So what do? You fake it to make it. So I wrote the story and I met these two incredible women. I wish I could remember their names. And they told me their stories. And I was hooked. I wanted more of this. I wanted to hear about what made people tick. And so, as Lynn said, I was very, very lucky. I worked in journalism initially at a time in the 80s which was just overflowing with creativity, incredible people, and incredible stories. And I started to learn my craft. And the one thing that you're taught as a journalist is you're not the story. You listen, and that listening is actually a really, really vital skill, and I think it runs right through life. It's not just about storytelling, it's about how we live, if we can listen. And that's, as I said before, it's not that kind of, interrupting. It's letting people be, and letting people trust you enough to talk to you. Sometimes it worked brilliantly, sometimes it didn't work at all. I can remember doing some interviews that were just so painful. David Byrne didn't want to talk to me, Talking Heads, didn't want to talk. I danced on the table pretty much. He just wasn't having it, wasn't interested, didn't work. And sometimes people did want to tell me stories and I didn't listen, and that was a learning curve. And the one that I really remember more than anything else was Phil Collins, a musician. And I think I was probably a bit tired because we worked hard. You were up until 2 in the morning going to events and things, and then you'd go home and then you'd be up again and filing your copy over the phone at sort of 7 o'clock to the copy takers. And also, I thought I knew the story. I thought I knew what his story was. And in my head, I'd written it already. It was that, he was this nice man, happily married, happy family man. And so the limo came and picked me up, and off I went down to Surrey. And we sat and we drank tea, and it was great. And he was lovely. And all the time, there was this little thing that was just slightly worrying me. And I was thinking, what's going on here? Slight spidey sense, but I knew the story, so I squashed it down. And then I went home, we said goodbye, I wrote my story, and a week later my editor phoned me up and he said, Jane, you know what's happened, don't you? Well, he's divorcing his wife. It's the whole thing's fallen to bits. Why didn't you get that? And it was like, why didn't I? He was desperate to tell me. When I look back, it was all there. But I was so convinced I knew what his story was that I didn't let him speak. And I'm sure we've all done that. You meet people and you think, oh, I know what you're like. You're like this or you're like that because of the way you dress, because of the way you speak, whatever. And it's not necessarily true. And never assume. I think that was one of the main lessons I've learned. If I would ever say, one piece of advice I would give to everyone is never assume, always ask. And I'll tell you a little slightly funny story about how that worked. When I was writing a story for ID magazine on chaos magic, and the guy that had invited me was very sort of dark and edgy and dangerous, or so he liked to think. And he said, this could be pretty scary. He said, we're going to summon demons probably. So I was sort of like, all right, okay, fine, and trolled along to Hackney, and they said, oh, we're not quite ready yet, so make yourself at home. I said, I just need to go to the loo. So off I went, and I wandered down, and I thought this room was the loo. I opened the door, and the room was empty, apart from it's full Devil Rise Out here, magic circle on the floor, sigils all the way around, candles waiting to be lit. And in the middle of the circle was a baby.
Oh my goodness. Oh, a real baby.
A real baby. A real baby. And everything went through my head. It was literally, I'm in a Dennis Wheatley novel. Now, what do I do? This was before mobile phones. Do I scoop up the baby?
Yes.
Do I? And I was rubbish with babies, so I was standing there just sort of going, and then just when I'm sort of like, I've got to pick up the baby and run, the door opens, and this woman sweeps in. She looks at me, looks at the baby, and then looks back and she, oh, for heaven's sake, who left Tanit in the magic circle? And she ran forward, spooked her. She said, why didn't you pick her up and comfort her? What's the matter with you? And off she stormed. And so, never assume. So that all seems a long way away from well-being. How did I get into it? Well, I was lucky, blessed. I grew up in a family who were into this stuff. It was the 60s, my mother was doing yoga, my brother thought he was 12 years old, and he thought it was really funny to sort of see how far I could bend. So he sort of pick up my legs and put them behind my head and all kinds of things. I can do a perfect full lotus purely because he bent me into postures when I was a kid. Actually that doesn't work out so well because yoga teachers often think that I'm far better than I am. They see me sort of sitting there, on the yoga, she can do anything. Nah, just a few. My mum was interested, she was a homeopath, she was interested in herbalism and flower remedies. I picked up Zen Buddhism and Kabbalah along the way. And so by the time I was in my 20s, this was just part and parcel of what I did. It was part of who I was. And I never really thought much about it. And when I was at the Evening Standard, occasionally my editor would sort of look over at me and she'd go, Jane, we need to do a weirdy-beardy story. It's like, I think you need to go and do astro-reflexology or something. And so off I would go and do that. And one thing sort of led to another. And I guess it's the story really of a lot of my life. I tended to be in the right place, I guess, at the right time. And one of the sort of bigwigs there sort of phoned up one day and said, "Oh, you know, we understand that you're an expert in alternative health." And I did what, of course, we all do in these situations. Oh yes. And I wrote a big series about alternatives. It was called Alternative Health. And from there I went on and, as Lynn said, I ended up at the Daily Mail, well, not as a freelance for Daily Mail, writing this column called Self, which meant that every week I reviewed experienced and reviewed a different form of therapy, which was wonderful and awful. Because after about a year of this, I think my poor body didn't know quite which way it was going. It was, you know, polarity therapy this week, and then, I don't know, biodynamics next week, and it was, whoa, I don't know. But it was fascinating. And the thing it taught me, I think more than anything, was that as a storyteller, what you can often do is make complicated ideas simple and accessible. Because a lot of these ideas were new then. People didn't know what these things were and how they could work. And for the first time, really, I started putting myself in the story, because I thought, well, I'm not sure about this. You know, do I have to take all my clothes off? Is it going to hurt? Is it going to be embarrassing? Is it going to be uncomfortable? And so I thought if I could explain how I felt, that would maybe encourage other people to think either, well, no way, you stick with that one yourself, love. I'm not going anywhere near that with a barge pole. Or, actually, yeah, that's something I'm interested in. That's something I would possibly be able to do. Which is great, but it's also can be hard and helpful. Having your story out there in public is not for everyone. And I would say, if it's not for you, that's fine. Don't do it. And don't tell your story unless you feel you are in a safe place. Physically and emotionally and mentally. I got used to it over years, and now I do tell my story in public places because I hope it will help people. But it's not for everyone, and I think that that's really important. Don't ever feel pressured. Don't ever feel that you have to. But, ooh, I just knocked over. Oh, there we go. As part of my work, I started going to more retreats. And this was where I think I learned the power of listening and the power of ferreting down to your real story. I thought my story, to use your word, once upon a time, there was a little girl who believed there were fairies at the end of the garden and who believed her childhood was perfect. And then her father died when she was 10, and she believed that everything bad that happened to her after that was because of that thing. But then she found out that there were other, deeper, darker things happening in that childhood, which stretched back over generations, which affected her life and the lives of everyone around her. And how I uncovered that was by listening to other people's stories. I went to a retreat called Penningham, which is up in Scotland. It's something called the Penningham process. And the basic belief is that we have a core self that is joy and life. And then what happens is that things happen. People are not necessarily good to us. Beliefs come in, criticisms come in, and we start building up fear and shame and anger and all those things that are unacceptable. And we can't show those to the world, so we armour ourselves against them. Physically, with our musculature and our fascial system, and mentally and emotionally. And so we closed down. How do you break through that? Some things are so hidden that we don't even know them ourselves. And sometimes you need to hear someone else telling their story in order to understand your own. And that happened for me at Penguin. There were a lot of amazing techniques there, but one that is very simple, and that's that we would all sit in a circle each day, and you'd go round, and people would say how they felt in that moment, at that moment. But, this was a case where we do use but, not and. You were not allowed to think about your story until it came your turn. You had to listen to each person. And that's hard. That's really hard, because what we want to do, I could see it when you were, before you said, all right, I want you to go back and tell me your story. And I could see it in people's eyes, and like, oh, crikey, what's my story? And were they listening to everyone? Possibly, but also, and how am I going to say it? I'm going to say it differently. We all do it, but it's such a good exercise. And the other thing is that when you really, really listen, sometimes something will trigger something in you. And that will really bring up your story. As I say, I thought I knew what mine was. And then this woman, one day, sat there and she said, there was abuse in my family, and it ran back through generations. And I started shaking. And then I blanked. I went completely blank. I didn't hear another thing that happened for the next 10 minutes. And so when it came to my point to speak, I said, well, this is what happened. I said, I heard that, and I haven't heard anything since. And I started to unpick what had gone on in my family back through generations. And that was the start for me of starting to heal, and of starting to understand where I came from and what my true story was. And it was painful. It was really, really painful. It's a heroine's path. It really is. And the first day we did a dynamic meditation, and which gives you the chance for catharsis. And I cried, and I cried, and I could not stop crying. And I cried for an hour or more, and then I went away and I cried until I broke all the capillaries around my eyes. And the second day, the anger started coming through, and I screamed, and I screamed so loud and so hard that I could barely speak in more than anything other than a whisper for the whole week. Now that's not for everyone, and I'm not saying it is. And I think there's some interesting questions around, do we re-traumatise ourselves by doing this kind of catharsis? I think it's a delicate line. I don't know, that might be something that you will have experiences of, you might want to share. But I think that uncovering is important, and it comes on to shadow work. And Carl Jung said the best political, social and spiritual work we can do is to withdraw the projection of our shadow onto others. And I think it's right. I think it's important. I think if we can withdraw our shadow, we can understand it, then we can start to heal. We can start to heal things. So I'd like to just read a little bit of this out to you, if that's okay. Am I going on too much?
No.
You sure? Are we all right?
Yeah, it's fine. Perfect.
When I was small, I used to peer under the bed, petrified of the dark beast I was convinced lay underneath. I had nightmares of a black cat-like creature which stalked me throughout my childhood, my teens, and into adulthood. And for years and years, I sought to avoid and ignore it, hoping it would forget me and go away. And it wasn't until I started to study Jungian psychology and became fascinated with art therapy that I dared face my beast. And my beast turned out to be something quite wonderful. She was my own repressed animal self, my wild feminine energy, my sensuality, my inner wild woman. And she appeared as I painted, first as a terrifying monster that I barely dared look at, and gradually transforming into a powerful Sekhmet, the Egyptian lion goddess. Next she became a sinuous dancer, and then a delicious strumpet. I realised that here was a huge part of myself which I had denied and repressed. She contained my shadow material, my dark energy, which craved release. In Jungian psychology, the shadow carries everything that we push aside during our waking conscious life, all the qualities that do not fit with our ideal image of ourselves, and everything which makes us embarrassed, shameful, small. The shadow can be full of hate, rage, jealousy, shame, laziness, aggression, greed, lust, or untrammeled sexuality. And the shadow comes to us most strongly in our dreams as that frightening other, usually the same sex as ourselves. He is the vicious murderer, the cunning thief, the loudmouth zealot, the overbearing teacher, the pathetic wimp, the down and out, the whining child. And our shadow often surfaces also when we lose it. Something triggers us, and we hit out in a sudden, uncharacteristic bout of fury. Or we get blind drunk, wake up next to a stranger, feeling stunned and horrified that we just weren't ourselves last night. And we weren't ourselves. We were our shadow. And the shadow isn't always negative, and I think this is really important. It can also be full of wild, wonderful energy. And if, as happened to me, you were told that you're too much, too loud, maybe too sexy, you suppress wonderful things as well. And the aim here isn't to destroy the shadow, but to integrate it into our conscious lives, to make it conscious, as Jung said. So its immense hidden energy can be used for our own good. And I would add, not for others' harm. So I kept digging away at my story, and as I say, telling it in papers, newspapers, and getting some really, really vile comments along the way, because they always say to you, don't read your comments. But you know what? I always read my comments. Partly because I think it's fascinating. I think it's truly fascinating, and I have developed a thick enough skin now that it doesn't bother me. And if someone says, oh God, as they often have, oh, she's just a menopausal old hag, I go, yeah, damn right, honey, I am, bring it on, I don't care. But it tells more about them, because something I've said has triggered them. And then people will always, it's interesting, pick up on one particular thing. And then there may be an explanation for that down below, but oh no, just in on that. And it is purely, I think it's fascinating. I just do think it's fascinating. So anyway, this all went on, and I could tell you endless stories, but I will just read out one that was quite a little bit about my own story again. This was something I wrote for You magazine, and Mail on Sunday, about going on a Tantra course. For as long as I can remember, I've been at war with my body. Even as a child, I never felt happy in my skin. My mother was very slim, very glamorous, and very screwed up. She continually commented on my sticking out tummy, still there. When puberty struck, I skipped past the trainer bar stage and went straight into a double D-cup bra. With my generous cleavage and skinny legs, I felt painfully out of proportion. My mother, however, was a keen advocate of dieting and put me on all the latest fashionable regimes. But here I am, still carrying the puppy fat. I also realised that I have punished, ignored and loathed my body for my entire life. Inevitably, it's had a knock-on effect in my relationships. When I met the man I eventually married, I couldn't believe he liked my body. After 20 years together, I still couldn't leave the lights on when we had sex. When we separated, it felt as though I'd thrown the off switch on my sexuality once and for all. So I went to do a Tantra course. Why wouldn't you? Welcome, said a young guy with red harem trousers. And he ushered me into the retreat centre where a smiling woman handed me a waiver form to sign. My eyes snagged on one line. It's a tunnel vision. I accept responsibility for my own personal and sexual safety throughout the course. There was mention of condoms. There was mention of lube. And I blanched. But this was Tantra. What did I think was going to happen? Extreme tickling? Did you bring your blindfold? Asked the woman, tapping a copy of the what to bring list. No, I think I must have missed that, I said, and I scuttled away to my room. "Welcome," said Jande, a tall, lithe woman clad in red. Red's very tantra. "This isn't a dating agency," she said firmly, "and it's not a training for orgies. It's about feeling at ease in your body, learning how to communicate your boundaries, and allowing yourself to be vulnerable." Needed all of that. She asked all the women to move to one end of the room and all the men to the other. "Now close your eyes. How do you feel as a woman? How do you feel as a man?" And I became aware of everything I hate about my body and how I haven't ever really felt like a proper woman my entire life. That still makes me feel quite uncomfortable reading that out, even now. And I wrote this a few years back. What came next completely threw me. Jan invited us to take off as many or as few clothes as we wished, and I wriggled out of my leggings and then froze. All around me, people were stripping off seemingly without a second thought. Panic, shame, guilt, fear, anger. Watching people appear so at ease in their bodies broke me, and I started to cry. And that night I barely slept. I've always pushed myself through fear. Despite being absolutely terrified, I once paraglided off a mountain, because everyone else was doing it. But this wasn't the right approach here. Only do what feels right, Jana told us, and I gave myself a good shake. Do I want to have sex with strangers? No. Do I want to be stroked by people with whom I feel comfortable? Perhaps. Do I want to take off all my clothes? No. No. People pleasing was something I'd done all my life, and it had to change. The following day's exercise was surreal. I sat on a mattress with 2 cushions representing my mother and father. And the tears came easily as I remember my father who had died when I was 10. And then my sorrow turned to anger as I picked up the cushion representing my mother. I was furious. I realised my mother was the only one who was allowed to be sexual in our house, that the negative messages I had about my body had come from her. Did I feel I should cover up so I didn't threaten her? I wasn't sure, but I did know it wasn't a normal, healthy way to bring up a little girl. And I snatched up the cushion with a snarl and found myself biting it. Yes, I was chewing my mother as a cushion, and it felt flipping fantastic. So, after all that, am I fixed? No, I'm not. We're all works in progress, but I do think I'm more honest about myself these days, and I think I can be my own story, and I think that's important. There's that old saying, you know, you can't change other people, you can only change yourself. Do we need to change? Do we need to uncover, maybe? Do we need to go back? What do we need to do? I don't know. I can't answer that. Everyone is different. We all have our own stories and we all have our own roots. And there isn't one right way. I do know that. But I do know that shouting and yelling on Twitter doesn't really help anything at all. And setting up but situations doesn't settle anything at all. And if we want to change the world, I think we have to change the way we look at it and the way we interact with other people, and to be more interested in other people's stories and understand why they get to where they are. And I think telling our own true stories, it's not selfish and it's not self-centered. It's big work and it's world work. It's powerful healing work for global and personal healing. It's about building bridges, it's about building hope, and it's about we as women in particular finding our best version of ourselves and rising up and healing ourselves and healing our families. The one thing that I noticed when I came back from Penningham, I mean, I knew I'd changed, I felt I'd changed. I hadn't realised how much other people saw that. And at that point, my husband and I decided we were splitting up, and it was difficult. But he said after a while, he said, "You know what? You're different." He said, "And I'm envious. I want to feel some of that." And actually, he then went to Penningham himself, which absolutely floored me, because this is a man who has never meditated in his life, who just laughs at the idea of yoga. I took him to a spa once, and there's a picture of him, and he's never looked so miserable. You can just see sheer misery on someone's face. He's a very, very unhappy man. Anyway, and I thought, no, this is just not going to work. It's way too out there. It's too wacky for him. He won't be able to handle it. He won't be able to handle reenacting his birth or any of this kind of stuff. But you know what? He didn't. He hated all of that part. But he came back and he changed. He had changed. This is a man, as I say, who never meditated in his life. He meditates twice a day now. He does yoga every day. And he listens. He used to always talk unendingly, says the woman who's just talked for nearly an hour. But you never had a chance to get a word edgeways. And now he listens. And that, I didn't tell him to do it. I didn't ask him to. He decided to do that. And I noticed that there was a knock-on effect, that our son started being different. And now my son's 23 now, and I get a little shiver every time because he'll talk about a friend and he'll say, yeah, they were saying this, that, and the other. He said, no, talking about the shadow. I was saying, you're just projecting. It's like, yay! And that's filtering out. He said, I don't know, it's going to take a while with some of my friends. He said, but no. And that's all you do. I think, you work on yourself. You work on yourself the best you can. Because it's easy to feel helpless. It's so easy to feel helpless nowadays. And to feel that you can't do anything that makes a difference. And I think you can. I think finding your story, telling your story, digging deep and being true, and listening to other people's stories is important work. So I'd just like to end with the words of two women I think who are incredible storytellers. And the first is Lucy Pearce, who's author of Burning Woman, which I'm sure a lot of you have maybe read. And she says this: there is a collective burning igniting within women, a deep need to tell our stories and be heard, a longing to heal past hurts and move beyond them into something big and bold and fresh and new. Something is changing and we sense it. And then there's Sharon Blackie, who again I'm sure is familiar to some of you, who wrote an amazing book, If Women Rose Rooted, which I heartily recommend. And she said, the world which men have made isn't working. Something needs to change. To change the world, women first need to change themselves, and then we need to change the stories about who we are. Stories matter.